Hello, everyone, and welcome to Context. This program is brought to you by the Idaho Humanities Council with funding from the National Endowment for the Humanities. The views expressed today do not necessarily represent those of the IHC or the NEH. My name is Joanna Bringhurst, and joining us today is Anne Campbell, a professor of English literature at Boise State University and director of the BA program in literature. She has a PhD in English from Emory University and is a scholar of marriage and family in 18th century novels. Anne is also the director of the Hendricks Martin Osher Lit for Lunch program and a co-regional director of the Jane Austen Southern Idaho Region Book Club. Anne, thank you for joining me today to talk about Jane Austen.
Thank you for having me.
We have been talking about Jane Austen in preparation for our conversation today, and even though she wrote over 200 years ago and only published 6 novels, Jane Austen is still as popular today as ever. Why do we keep reading Austen again and again and watching the movies and the TV shows?
I think there is a powerful pull the more that society becomes decentralized, fractured, and polarized, which certainly describes our current moment, the more we want to return to some kind of cool, peaceful place where things are as we expect them to find them. And they're the same every time you go back, and they're orderly in a way that gives peace to your mind in times of conflict. I mean, just this morning I was thinking about Austen as I drove my son through a coffee line, and the person who came out and took our order, I mean, I don't like those point of service things anyway, where they give you the thing to do a tip. But on top of that, the person actually asked me how much I wanted the tip. And my Austen came out. If it's a gratuity, right, you don't ask someone what the gift is. And I think when I go through those moments in modern culture where things are seismically shifting generationally or in terms of expectation of what your role is as a consumer or in a relationship with a business, I always think of Austen because she would have a nice little one-liner for that that I couldn't produce.
Yeah, I think you're right. And it seems that there is appeal there for both men and women. Like you said, that predictability of the order and the routine of life for men and women was different in that time period than today.
Absolutely. And I think if I were at the stage where I was dating or trying to find a companion right now, I have no idea how people play that out anymore. I mean, in Austen, there is an old-fashioned sense of courtship and predictability. Okay, well, someone has exchanged a lock of hair, and everyone looks at that and the code is clear. That means that the couple must be engaged. Now, there are times when it turns out the couple has done something outside of the norm, and so therefore they didn't follow the rules, and therefore that assumption is wrong. But the assumption is very ingrained in the society, so it's easy to track where you stand with someone. I think that's much more challenging now, for certain.
Do you think we have nostalgia for those courtship rituals of the past?
Absolutely. Exchanging letters, exchanging tokens, knowing exactly where the relationship is going, ethical considerations of character and what it means to be responsible to your community. Those are all things that we find in Austen that are fractured, certainly in the modern world. I mean, some for the good, some for the frustrating, but to enter back into that world in your mind is to find a place of peace and placidity that you aren't going to find outside of it.
I'm glad you brought up community because that is a big part of life for Austen's characters is they interact with their community in understandable, predictable ways, and they seem to find so much connection and community that maybe we're missing today.
I think absolutely, especially I think after COVID, community is one of the things that suffered the most devastating destruction. And, turning to some of the things like the Lit for Lunch series and the Austen book club, those became urgently important to me as part of my life. Some during COVID and some after it, but because it's so important to feel integrated into a community and feel meaning and connection in your daily life to other people of goodwill. And those provide that for me. And I think the more that you engage in the community, yes, you're putting energy outside of yourself, but that energy comes back tenfold. And there's a reason that people who value that connection are often drawn to Austen, because they find that in there and they apply it to their own lives.
You're reminding me of the dances in her books and in the film portrayals where everyone goes, they know the dress code, they know the appropriate etiquette and behavior, how to host, how to be a guest, and the way that they interact through dancing is such a formal structure. I don't think we have anything that resembles that today, do you?
No, not at all. And I think that there is, within that structure, in the novels, people are evaluated for how much they understand it, whether they can perform it. I love the part with Collins in Pride and Prejudice where Darcy is, he goes and introduces himself to Darcy without a formal intermediary. And you can just imagine, you see it in the movies, which is so wonderful. Darcy looking at him like just aghast. You don't do that, right? Don't you understand these implicit rules? And everyone does understand them, but when he violates them, it becomes a subject of gossip in the neighborhood and humor and criticism. But for that to happen, there has to be a common understanding of the rules to create that kind of ethical debate around violating them, for what reasons and when. If you don't have a common understanding of the rules, all the other stuff can't even happen.
I think you're totally right. And something else similarly that I enjoy about Austen's books are you see the characters, particularly women, navigating life at all of its stages and ages in interesting ways. It's not just about a young woman. You also see the mothers and the older women and women who have never married and young girls and how they are navigating life and these courtship rituals, no matter their role.
And I think that the better characters in Austen, the ones that are marked as ethically admirable, are the ones who integrate characters from all stages of life into the community, into their lives. I mean, Emma isn't what we're talking about today, but her responsibility that she breaches to, a poor widow in the community comes up for a lot of criticisms because the expectation is that she is supposed to, as somebody in the community of high standing, make sure that everybody is included and valued in the community, whether young, old, whatever their social position. And I think that for women, you see a lot of characters in here who are widows, who are the unmarried sisters, or who are different stages of life, finding a place in the world to be connected and to be able to enact Austen's values.
I think we usually think of Austen fans as being women, but there are many men who also
underground Austen fans.
Yes, who also value the roles that men play in Austen novels.
Yeah, and I think we talked about this a little bit even just before we started the show. I think it would be very hard to kind of figure out what your role in society is as a young man now. I've got a 16-year-old. We were talking about sons and what that means. That on the one hand, there's an expectation of them treating everybody equally and respectfully and thoughtfully, which is what it should be. On the other hand, there are still old expectations of certain types of codified manners as well. And it's not necessarily clear which role is going to be rewarded at any given moment, and what it means to be respectful of women, while at the same time feeling confident about your value in society as well.
But in Austen's world, it was very different for men.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, interestingly enough, in a lot of her novels, what we think is the dividing line between men and women in conventional family relationships from the 50s is very different, because men don't work in Austen. Nobody works, really.
Apparently not.
So, I mean, their lives are much more close in structure, and women don't do childcare necessarily constantly in the upper classes because they have nannies and governesses, and so they both have leisure time and responsibilities to the community and hospitality that are would look different in kind of the 50s nuclear style family. But men did have their rituals in all these Pride and Prejudice, going out hunting together, or having drinks after dinner when the women went off and had tea in the other room. There were expected rituals of connection in the neighborhood with other men, and a role that they played in the family that is certainly different from the kind of not knowing exactly what role you're expected to play now.
Thank you for that. In our discussion, we decided we wanted to focus on two of Austen's novels that are best known, Pride and Prejudice and Sense and Sensibility, to explore some of these issues. Should we start with Sense and Sensibility?
Sure, absolutely.
Okay, so let's talk about the men in this novel and what society expects of them.
Yeah.
We have Edward Ferrars, who is a younger son in a big family that is wealthy, moderately wealthy, and Colonel Brandon, who is a man of leisure, who had a career in the military. And what is life like for them?
I think life for them, I mean, you see that with Edward, his sense of directionlessness. He wants to go into the clergy, but his family thinks that's not fashionable enough. But he's kind of a retiring, quiet guy. He wants the quiet life, and their expectations of him are different. And you see Colonel Brandon, who has been disappointed in love and, is now, from Marianne's point of view, a dithering old man because he wears flannel waistcoats, right? But he still has an important role to play in the community. He's seen as a bachelor, but he is somebody who is anxious to find a bigger connection to the community ultimately through marriage.
Right. And these are the men who are in a courtship ritual with the two main characters, two sisters, Marianne and Eleanor, who have very different temperaments.
Yes, very different. What is it? My favorite character almost in the novel, or the two characters, are the Palmers, who are minor characters, but I think they're just hilarious. Mr. Palmer being this kind of acerbic character who's always kind of nasty and getting off zingers. I think he was played by Hugh Laurie, which is perfect, right? And Mrs. Palmer, who is just the most good-natured kind of lazy thinker in the world, and they have these wonderful interactions where he says something nasty to her, and she says, "Oh, Mr. Palmer, you're so rude." And she laughs, and then that wonderful line she has where, "Mr. Palmer is just the kind of man I like." So you have these marriages that some of them appear ill-suited but work because of the personality types involved, and some of them ill-suited and in conflict, but overall, because people are integrated into larger communities, the individual relationship, even if it's not incredibly successful, can weather the storm. The Palmers have virtually nothing in common, but they're constantly traveling around and connecting to other people. Same with Sir John Middleton, and that's the biggest part of their lives, is this connection to a larger community.
That's right. You see the Palmers and the Middletons who don't seem maybe the best
they don't have
suited
a common
for
interest
each
necessarily,
other.
but it works because they both have the things that they enjoy in life that overlap. I love Sir John. Austen has one line, I think it's got a semicolon or something, it's a parallelism, where Sir John was a sportsman, his wife was a mother. And it's clearly meant to be comic and critical in some ways, but it also works, because Sir John runs around the country and collects people to go to dinner, and then Lady Middleton gets to perform dinner, right, with all of these. She's got an ample amount of money and she likes to entertain, and so even though these people have very little in common, somehow the marriage functions because there's a complementary expectation of what each of their roles is that they both are on board for.
Interesting. So when we see Marianne and Eleanor, evaluating their prospects for marriage, looking forward to the future, they've just lost their father, their circumstances have changed. How do they navigate these different relationships and these different opportunities?
Well, quite differently, obviously, was the title. But Marianne trusts herself entirely in her emotions, and she spurns convention and the kind of rules that Austen expects people to behave according to. She gets burned by Willoughby, who exploits that. And Eleanor, on the other hand, is so reticent and follows the rules so much that she ends up being poked in the eye by Lucy Steele, who exploits that. So there's all kinds of examples of how following your heart has advantages and disadvantages, and either extreme of completely acting according to the rules without any sort of concern for individual circumstances, or violating them without any concern for the consequences of that, are both two extremes that neither of them work particularly well.
Perhaps part of what's comforting also about Austen's writing and Sense and Sensibility in particular is there are happy endings coming. Marianne has her heart broken, but then that she ends up with the person who is right for her ultimately, and it's someone different. And Eleanor has this love that she thinks is requited, but circumstances don't allow them to be together, and ultimately the circumstances change and they can't be together.
Yeah, there's a lot to be said for a happy ending, and for what marriage represents in literature and in art, which is typically an successful integration into society, and a maturation and ability to kind of work within a community and a relationship instead of just being a free agent.
Oh, I like how you said that. Why do you think that Sense and Sensibility still resonates with people today?
Well, family conflict is not a thing confined to the past.
Unfortunately, no.
And brothers and sisters, still today, certainly as then, can have completely different personalities that come into conflict and evaluate and judge each other's lives consistently. So I think the family drama part of it resonates. I think also the fact that Marianne in some ways is a very realistic portrait of even a teenage girl today. I mean, she's hot-headed, she's moody, she's very emotional, she wants to read romantic poetry because she feels she's got the emotional depth for it, which society doesn't accept. So she very much has that kind of, anybody who's been around girls that age is familiar with that dynamic. And there's pretty much an Eleanor in every family. If there's more than one kid, right, you know what you are. Who's the one who's kind of the organized, get things done, practical, more type A type in the family, trying to get things consistently on track. And I think we're attracted to that. We're attracted to family drama, which is eternal. And we're attracted to the idea that there is somebody for everybody, where you can feel most yourself and most comforted and most secure in a relationship.
I was struck also reading Sense and Sensibility again, how I felt like I knew these people.
Oh, yeah.
The psychology of the individual that Jane Austen writes about.
The character types are timeless.
Yeah, yes, absolutely timeless.
I mean, that's why the Palmers, and the minor characters in Sense and Sensibility are my favorite. Lady Middleton, the kind of, she just likes to entertain, and Mrs. Jennings. I love Mrs. Jennings. She's described as kind of vulgar and over loud and jolly. You know, she's a wealthy widow, and she just does what she wants and tries to marry people off, and she's always in a good mood. And I love that. I love these kind of characters who are just, they're unconventional for Austen's time, but they make a success of it, and there's warmth and charm and generosity in them as well. I mean, Mrs. Jennings may seem like she's just kind of bumbling about, you know, being her loud, jokey self, but she's the one who invites the sisters to stay in London. There's a warmth and a kindness in her that that's really valuable and meaningful to the resolution of the novel.
And she is the one who cares for Marianne and Eleanor when Willoughby breaks her heart. And
yeah, she tries to comfort them in her own way, and she's just, to me, those minor characters are delightful characters in this novel. And the Palmers just, I mean, I wish I could see them in every scene. They just are hilarious.
I know. Do you think that we can relate more to the main characters or to the minor characters?
To me, I like the minor characters in it better. I mean, this is an early Austen novel, and it was originally written as a novel in letters and then changed to a different perspective. And I think it still bears the marks of some of the clumsy kind of transition from one very different mode to another. So Eleanor and Marianne, I mean, they're meant to be examples of two certain types of character, and so they can feel wooden at times or almost caricatures. But for some reason, the minor characters to me are the most lively and joyous part of the novel.
Yeah, I agree. I loved Hugh Lowry's portrayal.
Oh, he's the best. I mean, that's hard
Mr.
to separate
Palmer.
from thinking. I mean, every time I read this part with Mr. Palmer, I think of him. He's just the perfect Mr.
And we
Palmer.
all know that person, right?
Oh, yeah.
That sarcastic curmudgeon that...
Yeah, who may have, you know, who may be a good person at bottom, but they can't, what they really want is to, you know, be the original in the room and to have the zingers and just to kind of be above it all.
You're right. And then we see ultimately when Marianne is taken ill in their home, Mr. Palmer behaves so gallantly.
Yeah, he's a decent guy at bottom, but his ruling passion, which is a term used a lot during that period, it's kind of your dominant character trait. Below that is still a goodness of heart, but he finds that vulnerability, I think, passé or embarrassing to expose. It makes him, in his opinion, look silly and not particularly bright, so he keeps the best part of his character hidden.
One character that I was telling you how much I admire is Colonel Brandon, that he suffered a heartbreak but behaved so selflessly and gallantly in that situation, and now he is in love with someone that he has no expectation will love him back, and yet still is a true, generous, kind friend to that person. I personally would like to find a Colonel Brandon for a friend.
Well, it should be an Austen dating app or something, right? Do you want a Colonel Brandon? You know, do you want a Edward Ferrars? People can take little
Or
personality
you're just
quizzes
looking
to
for a
sort
Willoughby.
into it. Yeah, you
for
just
the
want a
weekend.
Willoughby for a good time weekend. Whatever.
That could be your $1 million
That's
idea.
yeah. I mean, well, as a academic, I'm quite entrenched in the inability to monetize anything I do, but I'm sure somebody who was financially smarter could do that. But it is true that those character types are very common. In fact, when I taught Pride and Prejudice in an honors seminar a couple of years ago, there was an HBO special. I can't even say the name on this, but it was F-Boy Island. And we actually talked about that in relationship to Pride and Prejudice, because Willoughby pretty much falls into that character type, you know?
Well, so let's transition to Pride and Prejudice. In this novel, we follow the Bennet family, who has a number of daughters, but we learn quite a bit about the older three.
Yeah.
Would you say? Do you want to tell us?
Well, at least two, you know. The third, kind of iffy, but I honestly, again, I kind of like, everyone loves Elizabeth. She's pretty much everyone's favorite character, and she is just delightful. But I find a lot of humor in Lydia, honestly, just the kind of brazenness of her. I mean, Austen, I think one of the things she does that is so brilliant is that she'll put people of different character types in conversation with one another in order to expose all their flaws without having to even comment on it. So, for instance, when Collins is trying to read, he wants to read Fordyce's Sermons, which is this, you know, tiresome, preachy tract on all the kind of submissive traits that women should exhibit. Lydia gets bored and starts talking about the regiment, where he says, "I never read novels," and her mouth drops open. I mean, that makes Lydia look terrible because she has bad manners, but it also speaks in some ways to what a kind of tiresome bore and sanctimonious guy Collins is, by insisting on reading these sermons to young women. So the novel is incredibly clever at putting characters into conversation to expose the strengths and weaknesses through the conversation and not through expository kind of didactic passages.
That's true. We learn a lot about each of the daughters in the Bennet family when their cousin,
yes,
Collins, comes to town, and they each have to interact with him in different ways. So how does the Bennet family operate in their community?
Well, it seems like this community is pretty limited, and you always feel in these novels there's a fairy tale component, no question, because there's really not much opportunity for these young women to meet men. Everybody in the community they already know. It's fairly small. Their role in it is pretty clear. They're connected to the Lucases. They're connected to a few other families, but how are they going to meet men? Any of them, really. Mr. Bennet refuses to go to London during the season, where typically women of that class would meet men, because he's just kind of likes his library and a little self-indulgent. And the mom is a bit crass, right? So at that first line in the novel, probably the most famous line in literature, potentially, about the universal truth of a young man with money and position, being in want of a wife. It's held up to some kind of, it's obviously an ironic statement. It's held up to ridicule through the figure of Mrs. Bennet, but it turns out to be absolutely accurate, because Mr. Bingley does marry Jane, and Elizabeth does marry Darcy, so these men who get imported do get parceled out to the women. Wickham marries Lydia, not a great match per se, but in fact it does turn out to be true that all of these young women find some kind of match when these men are thrown into the neighborhood.
Mr. and Mrs. Bennet have an interesting marriage as well.
Interesting is one term for it's kind of like the Palmers, in the sense that you've got the kind of acerbic, satiric father and the kind of clownish mother, but so extreme that it is kind of a dystopic looking marriage. Clearly, Mr. Bennett thought Mrs. Bennett was really hot back in the day, and married her, and now has a sort of contempt for himself based on the decision he made, and he's not willing to accommodate the reality of the decision he made and be a good father and find peace and value in that. Instead, he just isolates himself off in his library. So a lot of the problems in the family are a total lack of parenting. I mean, when Lady Catherine, who comes across as kind of the evil sea witch type character, but I love her, honestly, I find her hilarious. When she says things like, why didn't you have a governess? Why didn't you learn? I mean, it's a good example of putting those two character types in contrast or conversation, but by putting these thoughts in Lady Catherine's mouth, it makes it seem like they're bad, but the reality is they should have had a governess. They should be going to London and meeting people. They should have been trained and disciplined and had a more structured childhood, because you see, especially with the youngest ones, they're just kind of running around crazy.
Yeah, and I think that's part of the comfort in reading the book is these sisters who haven't had the most opportunities and the best foot forward in life still make excellent
but it works out for
matches.
them all.
It works out for them.
Even Lydia's happy because she, she has such low expectations and not much discernment, so wandering around the country with Wickham, trying to find cheap lodgings is acceptable to her.
That's true. Tell me more about the men in Pride and Prejudice.
Well, Darcy's the dreamboat, right? And of course we tie him up now so much with Colin Firth, right, who plays him in the show. I do remember hearing something that I thought was funny, that in VHS copies that people used to have at Blockbusters and libraries, if you remember those, there were two scenes, according to this kind of urban legend of Blockbusters, that were always fuzzy because people had played them and replayed them. One of them was the Phoebe Cates scene in the pool in Fast Times at Ridgemont High, and the other was the Darcy in the lake scene in the BBC Pride and Prejudice. So for very, it's an interesting parallel, because one's a kind of sexy shot of a woman and the other a sexy shot of a man, but in very different contexts.
Yes.
But that kind of romantic vision of Darcy is got some Byronic characteristics, but passionate and loving and loyal at heart in the end. He's the ultimate dreamboat prom king of literature, no question.
But he's also very socially awkward.
Oh, yeah.
Not able to express himself well. He doesn't behave as he ought to.
Well, and he's saved by a good woman, right? That's one of the ultimate plots of literature, right? She trains him up and he shapes right up, But, of course, in the novel, his brusque kind of behavior just overlies a good, loyal heart. In reality, a guy who acted like that probably is just a jerk. That's the nice thing about Austen's world is at the bottom there's a deep well of kindness and warmth just waiting to come out.
Maybe that's true of all of her characters. She seems to write lovingly about even her most absurd characters and expresses their psychology in more of a full way, where you see how the characters first react to someone, but then after time and intimacy, how that understanding changes, which is pretty reflective of real life.
Yeah, and they find a place where their type of personality will function successfully in the world, most of them. Charlotte Lucas is a favorite character of mine who gets, I think, pretty abrupt treatment by most readers of Austen, because you know, who wouldn't like Elizabeth better, who goes around telling off men all the time and does exactly as she pleases. But Charlotte is a more representative figure of the time who really understands the practicalities for women who don't get married of limited means. And she finds a way to make her marriage to Collins, who is a repellent character, successful. right? She chooses the back room where he's not going to come and stay because he can't see Lady Catherine from the road. She encourages him to go out and garden, right, for the healthful exercise. She enjoys her hens. I mean, she finds way to be content in the kind of middle road and choosing a life she knows isn't going to be fantastically romantic like Elizabeth's, but that gives her security and connection and gives her a role in the world that is her own.
That's part of, I think, why we return to Austen again and again, is that you see a character like Charlotte Lucas use her agency to build the life that will make her happiest in the circumstances that she has.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, what is that famous line? I wish I had it right in front of me, but without ever thinking much of men or marriage, marriage had been her object, right? But she knows herself, and she's self-aware about what she wants, and she's willing and happy to settle into it. And then you've got Elizabeth, who shoots for the stars and gets it because it is a comedy, right? Ending with marriage. So you've got both ends of the spectrum, and there's contentment and happiness in both in their own ways.
Mr. Darcy has a friend, Mr. Bingley, who falls in love with Jane Bennet. What is really interesting about their relationship is that they are so well matched and well suited in temperament.
The easy temperament, right? I mean, in a way, I almost think these two in life would be incompatible because they're too similar, you know what I mean? In almost every relationship that I know, there's a spender and the saver, and, you know, the more social one and the more introverted one. Like, these two are almost a carbon copy of each other. So it's kind of one of those relationships that I feel like looks good on paper, but like, would it actually work? I don't know. But they're both drawn to each other because they're very amiable, easygoing, people-pleasing type of people.
And then we have the opposite of that, right? In Mr. Darcy and Elizabeth.
Yeah, that's where all the sparks and the fireworks are.
So is their courtship traditional for Austen's time, where they exchange notes and run into each other? She shows up at his house and takes a tour.
I mean, I think it is, it's fairy tale context in that sense, because it would be very unlikely that he would be thrown into her orbit that frequently in the period. But I think that they're the model for every romantic comedy afterwards, right? It's always that kind of opposites attract, and it starts out with dislike, and it moves towards affection as they see each other in kind of pressured circumstances or learn more about each other. But it is much more. I mean, it sets the standard for the romantic comedy. You've Got Mail has the same sort of dynamic, right? All the 90s romantic comedies, they're always about essentially two strong-willed characters who start out in conflict and move towards mutual respect and resolution.
Yeah. When I was in 9th grade English, I remember my teacher saying, every story you've ever read or seen comes from the Bible, Shakespeare, or Jane Austen.
And there's some truth to that.
Yeah, he had this challenge of can you find an original story or plot that doesn't connect to those? And I was really surprised to see how much is inspired by Pride and Prejudice, Emma, Persuasion, Sense and Sensibility.
Oh, absolutely.
In our current literature and in television and film.
Well, it is the ultimate romance story, and there's a reason that it's the favorite. There are definitely people who prefer the later novels, Persuasion, but they're outliers in a sense. I mean, the average Austen fan, and for very good reason, Pride and Prejudice is the favorite. It is that warm place you go back to. It has the sparkling wit and charm of the characters and the interaction. It's got the gradual unfolding of understanding. And all of her novels are smart enough to end with marriage, right? Yeah. Any of us who have been married know that no marriage is smooth sailing. It may be very satisfying and joyful at times, but it's also going to involve a lot of conflict and being at odds at times. And so she has the perfect kind of end at the time when everybody's happy. And as you read it, you know you're coming to that, and there's a great deal of satisfaction in that.
Yeah. Earlier, you talked about how during COVID and after, you became much more involved and valued partnerships and relationships that you have with other Austen fans. Can you tell us a little bit about the Hendrick Martin Osher Lit for Lunch program?
I have loved this. Unfortunately, I got thrown into the position of running it when Cheryl Hendricks, who's the Hendricks part of the Hendricks Martin, who was a colleague and a professor at Boise State, she'd had a long illness and she died. And she was the one running it. So to honor her, a good friend, an amazing colleague, a great scholar, and just because for myself I had been really finding the value of these social connections through literature, I decided to take over that program. We moved it over to Osher because it's its theme and purpose is to provide college level intellectual material and engagement for adults 50 and over. So, I mean, it was right in my wheelhouse. And every year I do an Austen novel in there. And then obviously with the Jane Austen book club that I run, we do quite a bit of Jane Austen too. But I've found so much meaning out of that. I love teaching. I love being in the classroom. I love my field. But there is something, I mean, you're still having in a classroom, there's grading going on. Students, honestly, in their 20s, and I was at that stage at some time in my life too. Your life is all over the place. There's so many different things going on, so many priorities. BSU students have jobs and commitments and families. Some of them have children, parents they're taking care of. A literature class is a small slice of a part of their life. But in a lot of these other programs, these are often retired people, and this is a huge part of their life is these book clubs, and they have so much wisdom to share based on their life experience. I mean, I've brought my parenting problems to Lit for Lunch and gotten some good advice from people who've gone through it all before. And the way they connect the literature to their lives, to me, that becomes more and more of an important thing, is what do these stories have to say to us as people navigating the world? And, having read kind of some of the self-helpy type books, but more kind of what makes a good life, again and again and again, one thing you see over and over, of course, exercise is good, but that's a bit harder. Eating vegetables, it's never bad to eat a carrot stick, even though it never seems appealing. But the one that brings joy and that has incredible impact on people's health and longevity is friendships, either casual or glancing, even the interaction you have with somebody at the grocery store, but these kind of long-term intergenerational friendships that show up in Austen everywhere. In these book clubs, you form them, and they are a great source of connection and joy. And, I do all this stuff as volunteer work. My job is at BSU. And I get asked why are you putting all this energy into these things that aren't bringing you any money? And honestly, it brings me the greatest joy, these connections, and it has made my life so much richer. And I think COVID, in a sense, for a lot of us, was that stop sign in your life where you were forced to pause and think about what you value and what you're going to do going forward. And for me, emphasizing things that were connected to other people and connected to my joy of literature was where I wanted very deliberately to go.
I really appreciate you saying that just because we don't live in the time of Austen when those social connections were such a part of the structure of your life doesn't mean we can't find them. We just have to build them and create them and work at it today.
Yeah, they're there, and you have to take some risks and go out and make the effort to find them. But the reward is just tenfold for every bit of energy you put out there, and the kind of love and value that comes back, and the lifelong connections to people who are interesting and fun to talk to is just incalculable. I mean, I can't imagine not having these things in my life now.
And you're a part of the National Jane Austen Book Club as well. How did you become a member? And if our listeners are interested, how can they get involved?
Well, that's a great question, and I love the southern Idaho region of the National Jane Austen Society, and I love the National Jane Austen Society too. I got involved in it essentially maybe 5 years ago, 6. I made 2 New Year's resolutions. One of them, Henry was starting to get, my son, maybe 7, 8. I mean, he was still, there's a lot of demands, but I could see that his focus in the world was changing to his friends, and so I'm a planner, right? That type A Eleanor personality. I'm like, where am I going to go from here? What is my life going to focus on? And so I decided to take tennis lessons and to join the Jane Austen Society. Now, one of these things worked out, one of them didn't. I'm a very poor tennis player, apparently, and I hate running, so I was constantly ragged on in tennis class. That didn't go very far, but I joined the Jane Austen Society just as a member and started going to the book clubs, and the person who was running them, she was just starting up a new stage in her own life where she started a business out in Eagle, and so she really didn't have time to run it. And given my connection to BSU and the field, it was a natural, and so I just kind of picked it up and I started running Zooms, during COVID, which is not my favorite thing to do, but people were so excited to see each other in any kind of format. And when it picked back up, just the joy of people hugging one another and being connected, and their love of the books and their love of the community and their hospitality. I mean, being in some of these meetings is like living in an Austen novel, because these are people who care deeply about hospitality and community, and they have taught me so much about how to live a fruitful, meaningful, connected life.
If you are interested in becoming a member, we'll put the website.
Right, yeah, it's a fantastic investment. And just like as a little aside, I got my mom involved too, who lives here, and we do all this stuff together. Last year we went to the National Austen Conference while I was on sabbatical up in Victoria, and it was just amazing. And we're going to go to the one in Denver this fall, so it's become a new way to connect with my mother, as well as a connection to the community. And it's just such a great experience. She's now 80, right? So how many years she has left, it's not clear. But to have these experiences together over Austen is just something I will never forget or undervalue.
Sharing your love together.
Absolutely.
Well, to finish up, since you are an Austen scholar, I have to ask you, which is your favorite book?
Oh, yeah, that's
and who is your favorite character?
Well, funnily enough, my husband can't help but remind me, because, he's got a bit of Mr. Palmer in him. Got to get his digs in occasionally. When we first met, I must have asked him to read an Austen novel, and he obliged by picking up Mansfield Park, which I then was like, oh no, don't read that one. Read Pride and Prejudice. That's my first Austen novel everyone should do. And now he claims that he never read it again because I crushed his love of Austen in embryo, right? It's all my fault that he never became an Austen fan. But ironically, honestly, Mansfield Park is one of my favorite Austen novels now. I tend to really love the minor characters and their relationships and connections, and I'm not a big fan of Fanny, but the world depicted in Mansfield Park, I think, is quite brilliant and artistically complex.
Yeah. Okay, so if we have not read Mansfield Park,
start with Pride and Prejudice, but I'll never, I guess the lesson here, the lesson on my point of view is just that he was getting lazy and didn't want to read it, and so he was able to get a shot in there, but the lesson from his point of view is never discourage anyone from reading whatever Austen they want.
That's perfect last words. And it's been such a joy to talk to you. Thanks for being on Context. And thank you so much for speaking so beautifully about how important human connection is and how much it matters to a life of love and joy and a long life to connect with people that we love over things that we love.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me. I can never say enough good things about Austen and the wonderful people you meet through studying her and reading her.
Thank you.